The dull ringing thud of the auctioneer's gavel echoing over the gravel lot seemed to strike the very air of Jasper County itself. Beneath Iowa's pale, cloud-draped sky, dozens of people had gathered, desperate farmers in faded overalls, bankers in sharply pressed suits, small-time middlemen, and major land investors. "We'll start with an opening bid of $180,000, shouted the auctioneer. Numbered paddles shot into the air instantly. The figures climbed with such dizzying speed that most of those present quickly lost track of the bidding. At the very back of the crowd stood a woman. She stood out in her old, worn denim jacket, her thin lips pressed tight, her knuckles white with incredible tension. In her hand, she clutched a small brown paper envelope. Inside lay exactly $500, not a cent more. Hardly anyone in the crowd noticed her. It wouldn't have crossed anyone's mind that this woman was here to bid. Yet before long, every single person at that auction would remember her name forever. To understand how she ended up there, with $500 in her pocket against the millions of big business, you have to wind the clock back a few weeks. You have to return to the farm, where hope was flickering out with every unpaid bill. The spring of 1984 arrived in Jasper County, Iowa with a heavy, chilly delay. This time of year, the endless fields should have been humming with the rumble of tractors preparing the rich, black soil for planting. Instead, most of the land lay untouched and silent. Like a prolonged drought, the 1980s American farm crisis had dried up the financial life of virtually every home in the county. Loan interest rates had skyrocketed while crop prices collapsed. Banks were ruthlessly demanding repayment on debts that people simply had no way of paying. Every week, new wooden signs reading "auction" sprouted along the gravel roads. For the families who had worked the soil for generations, these signs meant far more than lost property. They marked the ruin of a family legacy, the erasure of memory, and the loss of personal dignity. On a modest 160-acre plot near the town of Newton lived 34-year-old Sarah Whitmore with her two children, 10-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Jacob. Just 3 years earlier, these fields had echoed with the ringing laughter of her husband, Thomas. Thomas possessed a remarkable, unshakable faith in the land. He always said that even the harshest season would inevitably give way to a thaw. But a tragic accident involving an old tractor cut his life short in an instant, leaving Sarah alone to face a grim reality. From that fateful day on, Sarah became everything to her children all at once: mother, father, accountant, mechanic, and farm manager. Neighbors genuinely admired her resilience and courage, but human admiration couldn't pay off the compounding interest on bank loans. Every morning, long before the first rays of sun cut through the dawn fog, Sarah was already up. She milked the remaining dairy cows, made a modest breakfast for the kids, and headed out into the field on an aging tractor. The field seemed to grow larger and more unforgiving with each passing season. Properly working the land took labor, fuel, and new equipment, resources she simply didn't have. In the evenings, once the children were in bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table. Under the dim light of a desk lamp, she spent hours poring over stacks of overdue bills, calculating pennies, searching for a way out of the dead end. By day, she stayed strong for her children, smiling and reassuring them that things would work out. But the kids noticed far more than she realized. 10-year-old Emily quietly stopped asking for new school clothes, neatly mending her old dresses instead. 8-year-old Jacob offered one evening to skip his lunch so there's enough food for Mama and Emily. Sarah would smile, wrap her arms around them, and then, once they were fast asleep, cry softly on the porch, hiding her face in her hands. Then came a rainy afternoon when the mail carrier brought yet another registered letter. Even before tearing open the envelope, Sarah knew what was inside. First National Bank was issuing a final notice initiating foreclosure proceedings. Unless the entire debt was settled within 30 days, the Whitmore farm would be put up for public auction. Sarah read the letter 3 times, not because she struggled with the dry legal language, but because her mind refused to accept the thought. The labor of 3 generations of Whitmores could be wiped out by a single paragraph printed on official letterhead. She neatly folded the paper and tucked it into the same wooden desk drawer where dozens of warnings already lay. A second later, when Emily walked into the kitchen, Sarah forced a smile. "Mom, is everything okay?" the girl asked quietly, looking at her mother's pale face. "Yes, sweetheart, just another bill," Sarah replied. Emily wanted so badly to believe her mother, but she couldn't help noticing the tears Sarah hadn't managed to brush away in time. That same evening descended on the farm in a thick, damp fog. Having finished her chores and milked the livestock, Sarah stood for a long time in the dim half-light of the old wooden barn. She ran her palm slowly over a massive support beam, one Thomas had reinforced with his own hands a few years before the tragedy. "I don't know how to handle this anymore, Thomas," she whispered into the ringing silence. But her only answer was the faint hum of the wind through the gapped wooden walls. A week later, the local bank manager, Harold Benson, drove out to the farm in person. Harold was neither cold nor cruel. Born and raised in these parts, he knew the history of every family and understood all too well the hell people were going through as they lost their homes. But rigid bank policy left him no room to maneuver. "The auction is set for June 18th, he said quietly, avoiding direct eye contact. "I'm truly sorry, Sarah." Sarah looked past his shoulder toward the distant hills where Thomas had once taught little Jacob to steer a light tractor. "Harold, there must be another way. We've been reliable customers for so many years." "I've exhausted every legal avenue I could," Benson sighed. "My hands are tied." Long after his car vanished over the crest of the hill in a cloud of dust, Sarah remained standing on the driveway. The children watched her from the porch, not daring to break the heavy silence hanging in the air. News of the upcoming sale of the Whitmore land spread through Jasper County with lightning speed. At the local diner, over cups of cheap coffee, farmers constantly debated which major players would show up to bid. One name came up more often than any other: Richard Hawthorne. Hawthorne was the largest landowner in the county, a man of cold calculation and virtually unlimited financial resources. Over the past 2 years, he had systematically bought up dozens of failed farms, consolidating them into a massive agricultural empire. Some admired his business acumen, others despised him for profiting off other people's misfortune. But on one point, everyone agreed. If Hawthorne set his sights on a parcel of land, outbidding him was impossible. When Sarah learned Hawthorne intended to bid, any lingering hope for a miracle evaporated. She knew no ordinary local farmer stood a chance against his capital. Still, every evening before bed, she walked her land with Emily and Jacob. They would stop by the old apple tree Thomas had planted the day their daughter was born. They would visit the small pond where Jacob caught his first bass. They would admire the tall red barn her grandfather built back in 1937. Every corner of this land held living memory. Selling it felt no different than erasing her family's entire history. On a Saturday, while cleaning out her husband's old workshop, Sarah accidentally nudged a box on a top shelf. Behind it sat a dusty metal container. Inside were old receipts, family photographs, and a small, worn envelope. On it, in Thomas's familiar, sweeping handwriting, was written, "For Sarah." Her heart froze. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside was a short note. "If you're reading this, it means life has taken another turn we didn't plan for. Please, never measure your worth by the number of acres we own. Land only matters because of the people who live on it. Promise me you'll keep believing in people, even when life gives you 1,000 reasons not to." Beneath the folded piece of paper lay 5 brand-new, crisp $100 bills. Thomas had set this money aside years ago for a rainy day. Sarah gently turned the bills over in her fingers. $500. It was a laughable amount. It wouldn't even cover a single month's interest, let alone save the farm from auction. Yet in that moment, it felt as though Thomas had reached across time to hand her a reminder. She was not alone. She carefully put the money back in the envelope. She had no solid plan, but she resolved then and there that this money wouldn't go toward daily expenses. It meant something incomparably greater. The day of the auction drew near. Expensive cars belonging to investors passed down the county roads with increasing frequency. Word was that the soil on the Whitmore property was among the most fertile in the center of the state. Sarah listened to the chatter in silence. Deep down, she had made up her mind. She was going to the auction. Not out of delusion, but because she couldn't stand idly by while strangers carved up her home. The night before, Emily asked softly, "Mom, are we really going to lose our home?" Sarah looked out at the fading sunset for a long time. Facing the difficult conversation head-on, she answered truthfully, "I don't know, sweetheart, but whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it with our heads held high." She pulled Thomas's envelope from the drawer. $500, a promise, and a memory, the only things she had left. The morning of June 18th broke under a thick blanket of fog rolling across the gentle hills of Jasper County. Sarah Whitmore had barely slept. Long before dawn, she stood on the porch holding a cup of cold coffee she hadn't even tasted. That morning, her home farm looked different to her, not because the land itself had changed, but because of a cold, clinging dread. This might be her very last time looking out over these dew-soaked fields as their owner. Inside, a ringing silence filled the house. The children had woken early without needing to be called. Emily was neatly making her bed, smoothing every crease on the spread, while 8-year-old Jacob quietly packed his humble treasures into a small cardboard box. His favorite toy tractor, a worn baseball glove, and a faded, framed family photo. Neither child asked where they would go when it was all over. Children sense adult pain acutely and often accept harsh truths long before adults are ready to speak them aloud. Sarah walked inside, fighting back tears. "It's time, kids," she said quietly. "We need to go." She walked to the kitchen table, pulled open the drawer, and retrieved Thomas's envelope. 5 crisp $100 bills. Sarah slipped it into the inner pocket of her denim jacket, not because she believed the money could buy back the land, but because the envelope gave her a tangible, almost physical feeling. Thomas was walking right beside her. By 8 in the morning, the gravel lot beside the Whitmore home was packed with pickup trucks, sedans, and even commercial haulers. The farm sale had turned into the main public event in the county. The mood among the crowd was mixed. Local farmers gathered in small clusters near their old trucks, talking in low, guarded tones about plunging grain prices and drought. Bank representatives set up documents beneath a white canvas canopy. Off to the side stood out-of-town investors in polished dress shoes that made it instantly obvious they had never walked through fresh-plowed mud in their lives. Some had come to snap up cheap land, others simply to witness someone else's ruin. When Sarah stepped out of her old pickup with Emily and Jacob, the chatter in the crowd died instantly. Men began taking off their hats and caps. Old man Collins, whose farm had bordered the Whitmores for over 40 years, walked slowly up to Sarah. "I am so deeply sorry it's come to this, Sarah," he said, a heavy grief in his voice. "Me too, Mr. Collins," Sarah managed a small smile. The old man reached into his pocket and held out a shiny silver dollar to Jacob. "Your grandfather gave me this years ago when I helped him fix his combine. I think it belongs with you." Jacob looked at his mother, and receiving a supportive nod, carefully took the gift. Just then, a line of sleek black cars pulled onto the lot. The atmosphere shifted instantly. From the lead vehicle stepped Richard Hawthorne, a tall, commanding man in an expensive, custom-tailored coat. He carried himself with the cold superiority of someone accustomed to considering every property his own before the ink was even dry. He was flanked by 2 lawyers, a financial advisor, and an assistant carrying thick folders. Hawthorne didn't offer the Whitmore family so much as a passing glance. To him, this wasn't a human tragedy. It was merely another lucrative transaction, a line item in a report on expanding his assets. "Well, that's that," one investor whispered to a colleague. "Nobody's going against Hawthorne. Word is he has no ceiling on his bids today." Sarah heard the words, but she kept standing straight. A single goal had taken root inside her, to walk this path to the very end with her head held high. At 9 o'clock sharp, the auctioneer stepped up onto the wooden platform. His loud, trained voice cut through the morning air. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the foreclosure auction of the Whitmore family property." The words struck Sarah's heart with a sharp pang. Not parcel number 4, not agricultural property, but the Whitmore family property. Up for bid is a plot of 160 acres, including the residence, dairy barn, grain storage, and water rights. We'll open the bidding at $180,000. Paddles went up immediately. 190, 200, 210. The numbers climbed terrifyingly fast. Every price hike felt to Sarah as though another brick were being torn from her house. Jacob squeezed her hand tightly, while Emily stared unblinkingly at her bedroom window, trying to imprint it on her memory forever. Very quickly, only 4 contenders remained: Richard Hawthorne, a large agribusiness firm out of Des Moines, a land syndicate, and an elderly local farmer named Walter Jenkins, who dreamed of expanding his land for his sons. But when the price crossed $300,000, Walter let out a heavy sigh and lowered his paddle. He couldn't compete with the giants. Soon, the other corporations dropped out as well. Only Hawthorne was left. $360,000, called the auctioneer. $360,000. Do I hear more? Silence fell over the crowd. The corporate representative shook his head and lowered his number. $360,000 once, cried the auctioneer, raising the heavy wooden gavel. $360,000 twice. Sarah closed her eyes, and in that very instant, as the gavel hung suspended in the air, her voice, dry yet remarkably clear, pierced the silence. "Excuse me." Every eye turned instantly to Sarah. The crowd stared at her in unfeigned astonishment and confusion. She took a few deliberate steps forward, stepping around the outer edge of the onlookers. "I'd like permission to ask a question before the auction closes," she said, maintaining a surprising calm. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment, glancing at the bank representatives. Harold Benson gave a brief nod. "You may ask your question, Sarah." Sarah looked straight at the auctioneer. "If someone wants to place a bid, are they required to pay the full amount today?" The investors exchanged glances. A few representatives from the big firm smiled patronizingly. The auctioneer answered with practiced professionalism. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. According to the rules, only a certified deposit is required today. The balance is paid within the time frame stipulated by the auction agreement." Richard Hawthorne allowed himself a faint, subtle smirk. He assumed the widowed woman simply didn't understand the basic mechanics of a financial auction. Sarah slowly reached into the inner pocket of her denim jacket. She pulled out Thomas's brown envelope, pressed it to her chest for a fleeting moment as if seeking support, and said, "I have $500. In the back rows, where the investor's young clerk stood, snickers broke out. Someone cracked a joke out loud. "She thinks $500 buys a whole farm." "This isn't a charity bazaar," another chimed in. Sarah didn't even turn toward the noise. There wasn't a trace of embarrassment in her bearing. She kept her eyes fixed on the auctioneer. "I'm well aware that this is not enough to buy the farm, but is it enough to register me as a bidder?" The laughter died down. Harold Benson adjusted his glasses, quickly shuffled through the papers on his table, and nodded. "The minimum registration deposit is tied to a fixed percentage of the opening bid. $500 covers that threshold. Technically, yes, you have the right to receive a paddle." The crowd went dead quiet. Nobody had expected a turn like this. Hawthorne frowned slightly. The clerk took Sarah's envelope, recorded the deposit, and handed her a plastic paddle bearing the number 27. Emily looked up at her mother in awe. "Mom?" "I told you, sweetheart. Your father always believed the main thing is to fight to the very end," Sarah answered softly. $360,000, the auctioneer reconfirmed. "Do I hear it advance?" Sarah slowly, resolutely raised paddle number 27. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $365,000. Richard Hawthorne snapped his head around. In his eyes, astonishment quickly turned to irritation. He thrust his paddle into the air. 370. Sarah raised her paddle again. 375. A genuine murmur swept through the lot. People whispered, glancing at each other, unable to believe their eyes. What is she doing? Where'd she get that kind of money? Has she lost her mind? Hawthorne motioned to his lawyer. Find out who's behind her, what bank is backing her. The lawyer slipped through the crowd, made a couple of quick phone calls, and returned 3 minutes later with a bewildered look. Nobody. She came alone. There are no credit lines, no investors behind her. Then why does she keep driving up the price? Hawthorne hissed under his breath. Meanwhile, the price soared past $400,000, a sum no rational appraiser would have assigned to the property. Local farmers smiled faintly into their mustaches. For the first time in years, someone was forcing Richard Hawthorne to fight for every dollar and lose his composure. But Sarah wasn't bidding to win the auction. She was buying time. Deep in her heart, she was praying for just one thing, that the person she had sent a letter to 3 days ago would make it in time. And at the very moment the auctioneer announced, $430,000, and Hawthorne raised it without hesitation to $435, a thick cloud of dust rose at the far end of the gravel road. A vehicle was approaching at high speed. The truck screeched to a halt right at the edge of the canopy. It was neither a luxury sedan nor a bank limousine. It was an old, road-dusted white Ford pickup hauling a livestock trailer. A tall man in worn overalls stepped out of the cab. He pulled off his cap and surveyed the crowd. The older farmers recognized him instantly. Is that David Miller? It can't be. David Miller had grown up in these parts, but 15 years ago he had moved to Nebraska. Once, he and Thomas Whitmore had been inseparable friends. In Nebraska, David had built a successful farm machinery repair and restoration business, helping struggling farmers get back on their feet. David walked briskly toward Sarah. Tears glinted in her eyes. You made it. I gave Thomas my word I'd always have his family's back, David answered gently. He turned to the auctioneer and pulled an old yellowed envelope from his jacket pocket. Excuse me for being late. I have a document that bears directly on today's auction. Harold Benson took the paper. It was a partnership agreement signed by Thomas Whitmore and David Miller back in 1979. Benson's eyes widened. My goodness. Under this agreement, Harold read aloud, should either family face foreclosure due to the death of the primary breadwinner, the surviving partner holds the right of first refusal to purchase the land at a fixed appraised value prior to any public auction sale. The document was notarized, but due to a clerical error, it was never filed in the primary bank ledger. Hawthorne's lawyers rushed over to examine the paper. 5 minutes later, one of them whispered grimly to Hawthorne, "The document is genuine. He has priority purchase rights." "And what is the buyout price under this 1979 agreement?" Hawthorne asked, barely concealing his anger. $220,000, Benson replied. David Miller immediately pulled a certified cashier's check from his pocket and handed it to the manager. Here is the full amount, to the penny. The auctioneer's wooden gavel struck the table with a dull thud. Sold! The crowd erupted into applause. Emily and Jacob wept as they threw their arms around their mother. The Whitmore farm was saved. Yet the story didn't end there. David stepped up to Sarah and handed her the paperwork. The farm is yours again. Years ago, Thomas pulled my family out of desperate poverty and gave me the money to start my first business. He refused to take interest and said, "One day you'll help somebody else." I've waited 12 years for this day. David then turned to the quieted farmers and pointed to his trailer. I brought more than just a check. In that trailer are refurbished generators, spare parts, and plows. My company is donating them to the 5 most in-need farms in this district for the coming season. Old man Walter Jenkins was the first to step forward. I'll lend my combine to harvest Sarah's fields. And I'll supply seed and fuel, shouted another farmer. I'll help rebuild the fence, chimed in a third. In a matter of minutes, hardened men who had been ready to accept the death of their own farms united into a single force. Even Richard Hawthorne, who had watched this chain reaction of human goodwill in silence, walked over to Harold Benson and spoke quietly. I'm withdrawing my bids on the other bankruptcy cases in this county, and I want to set up a private, low-interest fund to support local family farms. No publicity. Months passed. The autumn of 1984 brought Jasper County one of the richest harvests in its history. Life bustled once again on the Whitmore fields. A new roof covered the old barn, and every evening children's laughter rang out from the porch. On a crisp October evening, Sarah stood by Thomas's favorite apple tree, watching the setting sun paint the harvested fields in gold. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the worn envelope with the $500 inside. The money had never been spent, but it had accomplished something far greater. It had brought people together and reminded everyone in the county that the greatest value on this earth is found not in acres or dollars, but in loyalty, memory, and the willingness to lend a helping hand in the darkest hour.